My name is Chuck Cooper. I'm from the Computational Science Center in CDER at FDA, and I just want to thank you very much for inviting me to present here at the annual PhUSE conference. I really wish I could have been there, but unfortunately I was unable to attend in person. However, through the miracle of modern technology, I'm able to present my slides through recording. So let me just start with a disclaimer. The views and content presented here do not represent those, or represent those of the presenter, but do not represent those of the FDA and shouldn't be taken as guidance or policy. An outline of my presentation. First, I'm going to give you an introduction to the Computational Science Center. I'm going to give you a slight background, just a few slides to give you a sense of some of the challenges that reviewers have experienced, and then describe some of the data standards efforts and review environment tool modernization activities that we're involved in. So the Computational Science Center is essentially launched as an attempt to modernize the review environment through supporting high-quality quantitative analyses for efficacy, safety, and product quality over the product life cycle. The idea was to support CDER in improving drug evaluation. And this Computational Science Center was sort of the idea of Dr. Woodcock. And the idea, hopefully, the thing that we've been working on so hard, is to try and create sort of an integrated review environment. And this is a review environment that will integrate more advanced data management and bioinformatics capabilities with a platform that provides reviewers with access to tools and support as they need it. So some of the principles and goals of the Computational Science Center were very much focused on these core sort of outcomes. We want to improve efficiency of the review process. We want to improve transparency. We don't want the review process to be this black box where a sponsor submits their application and they're not sure exactly what's happening with regard to the core key review activities. We want to improve consistency so that reviews that occur from one reviewer to the next are more similar than they are dissimilar. We want to standardize the review process. We want to identify and develop core key analyses that represent standard approaches to doing some of the key analyses that reviewers do when they're performing their review activities. We understand completely that this is going to be very difficult to do by ourselves, and so we're very much committed to exploring ways that we can collaborate with others in the industry to try and improve our ability to succeed. And then the final thing that we're attempting to focus on is the idea of innovation. So what are some new ways that we can answer important review questions through development of new review tools? So this slide shows you sort of the big picture view of what we're working on building in CDER, and this is a future state that will support the 21st century review. And essentially, the idea here is that we want to be able to interact with and communicate with sponsors early on in the development life cycle, and give them some excellent clarity and consistency with regard to the types of data requests that we make and the expectations we have with regard to how the data should be submitted to CDER. Then when sponsors submit their data, we'll be running a series of quality checks and data assessments to determine, A, does the data fit into our data warehouse? Are there any errors that prevent us from using it within a data warehouse environment? And B, does it fit the need of the reviewers? Does it actually support the standard review activities that reviewers are interested in pursuing? And then once the data has been loaded into our data warehouse, in this case, JANIS is our relational data warehouse that's under development, we then want to make review tools available to reviewers to access the data that's in JANIS. And we're building what's called a reviewer portal. And that is essentially a centralized place where reviewers can go to access the use of any tools and support for those tools that then use the data that's provided by the data warehouse. And the Computational Science Center is focused on providing support for all the steps along this process. For the next slide, just to give you an idea of the background, when I first joined CDER in 2000 as a reviewer in the Division of Anti-Infectives, there wasn't a lot of standardization with regard to what was expected for the content of a review. And there's a lot of variability from reviewer to reviewer about what actually went into a review. And so, for the most part, a lot of reviewers just sort of made up what made sense to them, and so there's a lot of inconsistency. So, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of effort was put into trying to standardize the review document. So they did a guidance to reviewers on how to conduct a safety review was developed. A clinical review template was developed, which provided sort of a roadmap for reviewers so they understood exactly what was expected of them with regard to the different assessments of an NDA or BLA that came in. And then finally, the 21st century review process was developed, which has a lot of very specific timelines that can be very strict and tight at times. And so the next slide, I show you the table of contents for the clinical reviewer template, and then following that, the actual cover sheet for the guidance to reviewers on how to do a safety review. And then the following slides show a series of assessments or analyses that reviewers are recommended for reviewers to do through the guidance on how to do a safety review. And you can see, when looking at these three slides, that it's an awful lot of sort of assessment to cover. There's an awful lot of review work that would go on to trying to assess these different safety issues. To understand why it's difficult for reviewers to actually perform those kinds of assessments, let me just describe for you what the review environment is like for the clinical reviewers. And for the most part, I'm describing for you the perspective of a clinical reviewer, because that's my background, but also because those are sort of the clinical reviewers are the ones who are sort of oftentimes leading the review process and doing a lot of critical safety assessments and integrating information from disciplines. And so they have a need to ask questions frequently with regard to different safety and efficacy issues. And what I'm going to show you is just one example of some of the challenges they may experience when trying to do this. Keep in mind that clinical reviewers are typically physicians who, have a lot of clinical background. They may have tremendous clinical knowledge and experience, but what they don't have is data management skills or programming skills. So when they're given a bunch of data sets for a particular clinical trial and told to answer a particular question, it can be quite a struggle for them. So here's an example from one of the divisions. This was a few years ago. Essentially, the question that this reviewer had was with regard to liver toxicity. The reviewer had a simple question of how many patients had liver enzyme abnormalities of a certain level, were there any confounders, and were there any serious events. And because the data is distributed for each patient is distributed across multiple data sets, trying to answer questions in which the key data points or data elements are scattered around all these different data sets becomes very difficult for clinical reviewers, and they don't have an easy way to bring the data for an individual patient back together very easily. So typically what they might do is to use a very common software product called JUMP, and they'll open up these different data sets, and you have adverse events data in one data set, concomitant medications in another data set, lab data and demographic data in other data sets. And then they'll start to try to identify patients of interest and associated data of interest, and then try and bring it together into one large spreadsheet. So they're sort of, in a very manual way, identifying the information points of interest and through multiple merges and concatenations are bringing this information back together. And this is just one huge spreadsheet that gives you an example of one reviewer's attempt to try and bring all that information that's scattered around the different data sets and bring it back together again. And using this sort of old-fashioned style of data exploration to drill down on this kind of data, you would simply hold your face closer and closer to the page, and that's the type of drill down that we're talking about with this sort of antiquated approach. And so the result of this reviewer's effort is there really is no reliable way to reproduce what that reviewer has shown or done. A lot of time went into just answering this one question, and still there's a lot of difficulty in understanding the temporal relationship of this data. And this is a very frustrating and difficult process, and very reviewer dependent, depending on their sort of their computer skills and their ability to use these tools. And even yet then, there are multiple unanswered questions that reviewer had after this exercise. The patient still, wasn't sure about whether or not any adverse events led to discontinuations. They still were uncertain about some baseline factors that may be predisposing patients, and final status of the patient. So there's still multiple things that they still couldn't really answer easily from this exercise. So given what I showed you with regard to the guidelines for reviewers on how to do a review, the reviewer template, the guidance to reviewers on safety review, and having seen what some of the manual data manipulations that clinical reviewers are having to do to answer simple questions, I think it's pretty easy to see that trying to conduct a thorough review can be extremely challenging and frustrating and difficult. So what is the solution? And that's where we come back to the Computational Science Center. So the solution is to try and change the way product reviews are conducted within CDER. And we need to do that through the creation of a more modern, technologically advanced review environment. So as we were planning our strategy for how to do this, we immediately realized, first and foremost, that good quality standardized data really is a prerequisite, and a critical prerequisite for any attempt to try and modernize the review environment. And so we started focusing our attention on CDISC data standards, because those had been approved for use in the FDA in 2004. And initially there was limited uptake by sponsors. And we've received an awful lot of data that's sort of quasi-CDISC data, and it's not exactly standardized or exactly consistent. And so we were seeing a lot of variability from sponsor to sponsor. And that obviously makes it more challenging for us to create review tools that have certain data expectations or requirements when there's this kind of variability. So what did we do? So we realized we needed to improve the quality of data and the standardization of data, clinical trial and study data that we receive, so that we could build tools and capabilities off of that data. And so there's been an awful lot of data standards activity going on in CDER over the last couple of years. And I have some slides here that I'm going to show you that will sort of provide you an overview of some of the activities that are going on. First, there was an attempt to try and develop a CDER data standards program, a comprehensive program that addresses needs on all levels. We worked on the development of a formal CDER data standards plan. We developed reviewer training. We've created supporting documents that sponsors can use as references, and we've developed sort of an infrastructure within CDER that starts very high up at the management level and goes all the way down to the reviewer, so that we have participation on all levels within CDER on these data standards activities. This is a screen capture of a website that we have at CDER, And this is an external website that sponsors can go to, and actually sponsors are directed to this website frequently. And this is an example of an attempt by us to try and improve our ability to communicate with sponsors what our needs are with regard to data standards. This slide provides an overview. It's a very high-level overview of the CDER Data Standards Program. And you can see the first document towards the bottom of the screen capture is the CDER Data Standards Plan, which you can read, and some other information about the CDER Data Standards Program. We have a program board, which is sort of a high-level, management-level board that represents CDER's interests inside the agency and can help with ensuring that the correct processes have been followed. And the next slide shows you a diagram taken from the CDER Data Standards Plan. And I'm not going to walk you through all the different points of this diagram. But if you go to the website and download the CDER Data Standards Plan, you can take a close look at this diagram and relatively easily get a sense of what this is about. Essentially, in the center of the diagram, you have what is sort of the sponsor submitting data and undergoing a review process, and the boxes, the blue boxes below that central review submission process represent CDER's activities that involve providing sponsors with the information they need to understand what kind of data they should submit, and also a process that we're building to allow us to evaluate data rapidly once it's submitted and to determine whether or not it conforms to standards and also whether it will support the review activities of interest. And then the boxes above in green represent activities that are being developed that are focused more on refinement and further development of data standards. So as we determine that additional standards need to be developed, we're building a process that will allow us to pursue the development of those standards to support review activities. The next slide shows you another website that's external and to which sponsors are able to go. And this provides some more specific information about what CDER reviewers are expecting with regard to submitted data. And you can see the first document listed is the CDER Data Standards Common Issues document. And that's essentially a document that was compiled over the course of 3 or 4 years based on the experience that reviewers had with previously submitted standardized clinical trial data. So each instance in which a reviewer received SDTM data that was standardized and submitted in support of an application, when that reviewer had any difficulties that had to do with the implementation or the quality of that data, we collected those instances and incorporated them into this document with the hope that by making this available to sponsors, they would have an easier idea of understanding what it is CDER reviewers are looking for, but also to avoid common mistakes or to repeat common implementation issues that negatively affect our review process. So the next slide shows you the cover sheet for the Common Issues document. When you download this document, when you look at the cover sheet, if you look towards the bottom, you'll see there's an email address listed. And the idea here is to make it easy for sponsors who have questions with regard to the content of this document or really any other data standards type questions to have access to someone in FDA who will answer these questions. And there's a specific group of reviewers and support staff who check this email regularly and provide responses to any questions that are submitted there. And members of that group include people from the Office of Biostatistics, the Computational Science Center, the eData team. So, just like to encourage anybody who has questions about data standards to feel free to use that email address to get feedback or help answer questions. So some of the other activities that are going on in CDER with regard to data standards include reviewer training. We had some initial training that was sort of off the shelf and more focused towards industry that was not as effective. And we've completely redesigned reviewer training with regard to data standards to be more from the perspective of the reviewer will be in dealing with this kind of data. And so we have some training that's been going on this year that's this revised training, and it includes an introductory class as well as a class on SDTM and then another one on ATOM data. We've identified leads within each of the divisions that serve as data standards leads, and their role is to keep abreast of new data standards activities and inform their division of these, but also where there are issues or problems associated with a submission that relate to data standards, they bring that back to the Computational Science Center and the CDER Data Standards Program Board for discussion of how to address those issues and problems. So there's a good line of communication from the reviewer all the way up to the Data Standards Program Board to try and identify and hopefully solve any issues or problems that relate to submissions that came in standard data, with standard data. We're developing a CDER a data validation program, and the idea behind this program is to do an assessment of each submission as it comes in to determine, first, does it conform to the standards? Does it conform to the implementation guides for SDTM or ATOM or SEND? But also, we want to be able to start building the capability of assessing whether or not the data can support specific key review activities. And so this program that we're developing will allow for the ability to insert R or SAS programs or modify XML checks within the config file for something like CDISC. And the idea is to allow us very early on in the review process to have a sense of what data is there in terms of the quality and its ability to support specific review analyses. And our goal is, this is currently under development, but our goal is when this is completed, we want to be able to post all data assessment checks that we generate and include in this program, post it on our external website, so sponsors will have the opportunity to see what kind of data assessments we're performing, and also to be able to perform their own checks. We're very determined to make it easy for sponsors, as easy as possible for sponsors to understand what kind of data assessments that we're doing. And so we're interested in exploring the use of tools like CDISC, which are sort of freeware type programs, so that sponsors, regardless of how small or big they are, will be able to easily run the same kind of data assessments that we're developing. We're also very much involved in the activity of developing therapeutic area standards. A lot of the standards that have been developed for clinical studies are more focused perhaps on some of the safety endpoints. When you start getting into specifics about certain therapeutic areas, that's when we're seeing a lot of sort of confusion or uncertainty with regard to how to model that kind of data in a standard way. And so a major effort that we have, and if you go back to that data standards page, there's a link to some of the activities involved with the development of data standards. You'll see that we're really focusing on building out data standards as they relate to different therapeutic areas. There's also a guidance document that we're working on that hopefully will be finalized sometime soon that will provide guidance to sponsors on the submission of electronic data and electronic data for all studies and data in standard format. This slide shows you data standard submissions that have come into CDER over the last year or so. So if we go back to 2008, you can see that, or you can't see it, but I have the data. We've been sort of tracking how many of these CDISC data standard applications we've received. And for the most part, we're talking about SDTM. And if we look back at 2008, we had maybe, about 15% of our applications contain clinical trial data in SDTM format. However, if you look at this graph, and this is something that's available to anybody externally through this link that I provided, we post the results for how many submissions we received that included SDTM or ATOM data. And you can see from looking at this that it's somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of our applications now contain SDTM standardized data. And while that might not seem like a lot, when you think about 2008, just a few years ago, we were maybe only receiving 15%. This has gone up significantly, and we expect it to continue to increase as we move on. So, having talked about the data standards, or standardized data, and high-quality data, and all the activities that are ongoing to help sponsors understand what kind of data we're hoping to receive. Now let's turn towards some of the reviewer tools that are being developed to leverage that high-quality standard data to make it easier for reviewers to do their review work and explore data and answer questions. So if we go back to this overview slide that shows you sort of the overall environment, you see I have a little bubble that's pointing to the reviewer tools /portal section. And this portal is going to contain links for the reviewers to all the review tools that are available, as well as training opportunities, reference information, tool guides, and those sorts of things, as well as the tools themselves for web-based tools. So now I'm going to describe for you a very interesting activity that we undertook over the last couple of years. So essentially, a few years ago, we thought to ourselves, well, one of the key advantages to standardized data should be the ability to create standard analysis scripts that represent best practices for key important analyses of interest, and to be able to rerun them from sponsor to sponsor, from submission to submission. That should be one of the key advantages of receiving standardized data. But we hadn't really ever done that before in any sort of systematic way internally in CDER. And so we wanted to see, is it possible? Let's give it a try and see what happens. Let's see if we can develop standard scripts that we could run across multiple different submissions for SDTM submitted data. So we had this project called the Rapid Startup, the Tools Rapid Startup, and essentially what we did was we embedded some statistical programmers with the actual review team that was actually conducting an NDA that contained SDTM data. And we focused mainly on SDTM data because SDTM data, although there's still variability from sponsor to sponsor, it's a lot more consistent than ATOM data. We haven't received as much ATOM data, and there seems to be a lot more variability. So we really use SDTM data as our target. And essentially what these statistical programmers did was work with the reviewers to identify and define key analyses that those reviewers would like to be able to run easily from one review to the next. And so they developed the code and the methodology, working closely with our statisticians. And they also generated analysis specifications that were very detailed, so that when a reviewer would create one of these analyses, there's a very clear understanding of exactly the methods that were used and which data elements were used, which SDTM data elements were used. So the ultimate goal is to create a core group of common analyses. So then, let's go to the next slide here. So this is a table that shows you some of the analyses that were created. We have others as well. But this gives you a general idea, and this is a very high-level description. So we generated a series of analyses that were able to run as panels. So in demographics, for example, there are roughly 12 or 13 different analyses, so that if you launch the demographics panel, the output would be roughly 12 or so analyses that represent key assessments that these reviewers are interested in seeing over and over. And you see them for some of these other topics as well. Since the time that we first started this, we've embarked on the development of some toxicology analyses as well. So how do reviewers actually launch these scripts? So I described for you that our clinical reviewers are physicians with a clinical background who don't know how to run SAS or R, and how would they be able to use these SAS scripts or these analyses to be able to generate output to support their review activity. So we built this thing called the script launcher that reviewers could access through the reviewer portal. And the idea here was to make this as absolutely simple as possible. We want to make this a matter of just a couple of pushes of the button, a couple of button pushes to be able to generate the output. A reviewer wouldn't have to spend an awful lot of time becoming familiar with a sort of proprietary, off-the-shelf type software program interface and learn how to use, a particular commercial tool to be able to launch these. They would be able to create these analyses with very little training. And so this is what the prototype looks like. I've blacked out any of the identifiable information that might pertain to a particular application. And you can see once the reviewer has selected an NDA or BLA in a particular study, they have the option to choose any of these different analyses panels that have been created. And when they select one, information becomes available with regard to the particular analysis panel they selected. So in this case, I'm showing you the document that becomes available to you or to the reviewer that provides information about the liver panel analyses. And I'm only showing you the sort of half of the first page, but it's quite an extensive document that provides a general description, describes which data elements are used and how they're used. It describes any data merges or concatenating that may be occurring, and it also provides all the actual code. For this first version of the script launcher, we focused mainly on SAS and scripts. And as we expand this out further, though, we hope to be able to incorporate the ability to launch R scripts as well. So, having run that liver panel analysis, what the reviewer will see will be this Excel spreadsheet. And on the first page, you see a description of the different analyses that were run, a basic description that helps the reviewer understand what the purpose of these analyses are and what these analyses are. And then along the bottom, you'll see the different tabs that a reviewer can click on to see the actual analysis output. And because it's in Excel, if a reviewer wants to be able to import this easily into their review document, it's not difficult. So now onto the PhUSE Wiki. So if we're building the capability for clinical reviewers to be able to launch analyses that represent best practices for key standard analyses that they want to be able to run from review to review, we need to build these things out. And we're working with reviewers on an ongoing basis to generate more of these analyses, but we want to be able to share the code with people outside, with industry, with academia, for them to be able to look at the kinds of analyses we're generating, to comment, to have input, to suggest improvements, to collaborate around the development of better analyses that may answer those questions even more effectively. And so CDER's worked with PhUSE on the development of a wiki. And the concept here is that this is a space that really promotes collaborative interaction on the development of new statistical methods, or also the development of analysis scripts that could represent best practices. And so we intend to post our scripts within this wiki for industry to see, but we also hope that as we move forward, we'll have the opportunity to collaborate with people in industry and academia with regard to the development or improvement of these sorts of scripts, but also the development of additional scripts. This is another tool that we're working on making accessible to reviewers. It's called eDISH, and this is a different kind of tool than the script launcher. The script launcher is sort of very open-ended, create, we can import into the script launcher and make available to reviewers. So there's a lot of potential to expand it as we identify key analyses and best practices that are desired by the reviewers. eDISH is a different kind of tool, though, because this tool does a very specific thing, and it does it very well. This was developed by Ted Guo and John Senior. John Senior is one of he is probably the top agency expert on drug-induced hepatotoxicity. And he worked with Ted and Kate Gelperin to develop a tool for reviewers that would allow them to quickly figure out whether or not there is a potential problem with hepatotoxicity for particular drugs. And I have a couple of screenshots that show you essentially what this does. And it's relatively simple, but actually very elegant and helpful for reviewers in terms of helping them quickly identify whether there's any sort of difference between study drug and comparator with regard to the number of patients who may have a particular pattern of liver enzyme derangement. So the next slide shows you another screen capture from eDISH. So this is another example of a tool that we're making available to reviewers through a more modern environment. And a lot of effort is being put into establishing the kind of informatics, equipment, technology, et cetera, that's going to be necessary to run all of these sorts of things. The next slide shows you JReview. JReview is a tool that's in use within CDER right now. And it's a very flexible tool, but I think one of the interesting things to know is that some reviewers have worked with the company that produces JReview to create some analyses that meet specific reviewer needs. And the next slide shows you one of those analyses. This is a forest plot showing you the relative risk for study drug versus comparator by system organ class. And you may not be able to see it, but you can explore this further by clicking on a little plus sign to the left of each one of those system organ class names and drill down to the preferred terms. And essentially what this shows you is very quickly where there is a difference between study drug and comparator with regard to adverse events occurring in these different system organ classes. And you have the ability to run the same thing on the preferred term level. And then one of the additional capabilities it has is to be able to look at subgroups so that you could determine what this relative risk profile looks like for a male versus a female by simply clicking on these subgroups above to be able to change the relative risk plot. So trying to understand where risk profiles may differ for different baseline patient characteristics is a very difficult thing for clinical reviewers to be able to assess, but it's something they're very interested in doing. And this is a tool that was developed through working with reviewers who wanted to be able to have this capability to answer exactly those sorts of questions. The next graph is something from also a analysis capability in JReview that was developed through working with a statistical reviewer who had an interest to make this kind of assessment of a drug or biologic available to clinical reviewers and statistical reviewers. And essentially what this does is it displays all the patients sort of stacked up on top of each other, and you see the white line sort of a little bit in the middle that represents one single patient. And as you mouse over this graph, each patient, which is represented by a different line, will become highlighted, and you can drill down on the patient. And the colors essentially indicate for you whether the patient had a beneficial outcome with no adverse event, a benefit with an adverse event, no beneficial outcome, and an adverse event, and whether they withdrew. And by creating these for each drug within a study or a series of studies, you can visually sort of get a sense very quickly whether there are imbalances. And it's just an interesting way to do an initial exploration of some of the data. And from this graph, you can drill down quickly on detailed patient information as well. And again, this is an example of something that was developed based on an interest and request of FDA reviewers. The next slide, I'm going to talk about another tool called the MAED program. And this is essentially a program that runs a series of adverse event analyses based on the MedDRA terminology. MedDRA is the most common adverse event terminology that we see. But up until this point, reviewers have never been able to run standardized MedDRA queries. Because of the granularity of the MedDRA terminology, it's relatively easy to actually sort of miss potential safety signals, because they can be, an individual signal might be distributed across numerous terms, even though they represent the same toxicity. And what SMQ does is sort of bring that back together for you and identify potential signals that may have been distributed across numerous MedDRA preferred terms. So this tool will run all 140 or something, I think it's around 140 SMQs, all in a matter of a few seconds. And then it produces results that allow you to compare numbers of patients who meet the criteria for one SMQ compared to for study drug versus comparator, and then it sorts them according to difference. So it's just a very quick way for reviewers to get a sense of, are there any potential signals here and that I need to explore, and also helps them to understand whether there are differences for study drug versus comparator. And the other thing it does is produce a supportive data set that allows reviewers to explore further who are the patients who met criteria for specific SMQs. And then it also does analysis by all levels in the MedDRA hierarchy. And this was something that we worked with a company called CDISC to develop, and we'll be introducing it to reviewers in the next 1 to 2 months. The reviewers have the ability to run analysis on different levels of the hierarchy and select which SMQs they want to be able to create. And then they have the ability to determine which risk estimators they want to use. And this is an example of the output. And it is output in an Excel file. And you have the ability to sort by risk difference or relative risk for the difference between one arm and the next for numbers of patients who met the criteria for each SMQ. Now, one of the things that we're also doing is we're including in the output a large, red, bold language that explain to clinical reviewers a proper interpretation of these kinds of analysis output. We see tools like Script Launcher and MAED as an opportunity to also provide education for reviewers with regard to how to interpret some of these output. Safety data in particular, because there's often typically no predefined hypothesis. Data collection methods are variable, and endpoint definitions aren't typically pre-specified in a protocol. So this kind of data is very exploratory in terms of its ability to provide answers, and use of things like p-values and confidence intervals is fraught with potential problems. And so we're also creating the ability to send messages to reviewers about the output, how to interpret it properly, when should they be contacting their statistician for further help and interpretation. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is the PhUSE CDER Computational Science Conference. And this is a conference that we're very excited about that's going to be taking place in March in Silver Spring. We've had a couple of these conferences over the last few years that have been successful in terms of beginning dialogue with people in industry and academia who are working in the same space and CROs, but where we haven't had as much success is in the development of actual collaborative activities and work groups. And so we've worked with PhUSE for this coming March's conference to try and really make one of the key objectives to be the development of some collaborative work groups focused on specific areas of interest. And so I would just like to encourage you to go to this website and explore the content and put it on your calendar, because we'd love to see you. So in conclusion, CDER is moving very rapidly towards a more modernized, integrated review environment. We're working very hard to improve our ability to receive high-quality standardized data. We're developing analyses and identifying best practices, and we're making available to reviewers more powerful standard data-based review tools. And we think that there's additional opportunities for improved efficiency as well, but we also understand that in order for us to be successful, our best chance is also going to include collaboration with others working in this space from industry and academia and elsewhere. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.